During the colonial period, many independent monarchies, for example, the Zulu monarchy or the Benin monarchy in Nigeria, many of them had existed independently as independent kingdoms. But what happened during the colonial period was that when the Europeans came to Africa, they were not interested in observing or respecting boundaries because they did not look at those kingdoms as independent entities. They wanted to create economic units that they could control.
So not all African kings had absolute power. Not all of them. Some had to operate within inbuilt constitutional framework, what you now call democracy in the modern parlance. And as you said, Europeans came, took away sovereignty. You know, they were governing nations, indigenous nations, using primordial ideas. And when Europeans came after 1885, they came up with a Westphalian Concept, which began in the early modern 15th, 16th century. Separation of power, and they displaced European institutions to Africa. And in displacing that, and because these African nations had lost their sovereignty, then new models emerged that turned those kings in many areas, not in all areas, into symbols of power.
The British were notorious for deposing what they considered to be recalcitrant monarchs and actually sending them to other parts of either to other parts of Africa or even as far as the Caribbean. Because if you remember, Jaja in Nigeria was actually deposed and sent all the way to the Caribbean. And I believe a Ugandan monarch was sent to Seychelles, what is now Seychelles. And the idea was to destroy the authority that those individuals had so that the British could have an opportunity to control the colony that they had created. Now, in terms of, now the British were not the only colonialists that were doing that. The French did the same thing. In Cameroon, for example, the French deposed Njoya, who was the king of Bamum, and brought him to Yaoundé and left him there until he died there in under French control.
In some areas like Uganda and northern Nigeria, they were not symbols of power. They were part of the administration. And subsequently, new constitutions came in the second half of the last century. And it varied from country to country. In some countries, they created the House of Chiefs. And today, the power is merely symbolic with tremendous prestige.
Democracy is not foreign to Africans. If you look at some traditional systems that were in African countries before the Europeans came, many of those traditional systems were very democratic. If you can still see aspects of that in traditional systems in Nigeria, in Cameroon, and several other African countries, even in Uganda, the Baganda monarchy was relatively democratic in that the system was structured in such a way that the king could not rule as an absolutist, primarily because the king was subjected to several checks and balances that allowed the people to participate in governance. And you still see that all over Africa. So democracy, contrary to what most people think, is not something that is alien to Africans.
All these zones of power, units of power, they are not all grounded in the Westphalian system, in the European system. You understand? some of them are located in some other ideas, Islamic ideas, traditional ideas, customary laws that are not written. You understand? Which stabilize society.
Traditional rulers are custodians of very important traditions that Africans have had for many years, which the Europeans tried to destroy. So, contrary to what some people argue, there are a lot of African traditions that are very good. Child rearing, for example, traditions that have to do with child rearing. This idea that it takes a village to raise a child. But there are also bad traditions like child marriage, the denial of girls, the girls and women, the right to inherit landed property. That's a bad tradition.
You have to devolve power to communities. Who is a new member? Who is selling drugs? Who is dragging our young girls at 13 to prostitution network? It is communities that will do that for you. And you can organize those communities with a reference to where we come from as Africans through cultural agencies. And those cultural agencies can now involve those kings and chiefs.
What we say is that, yes, these African monarchies, whether they are monarchies like Morocco, Lesotho, Eswatini, or the Zulu kingdom, or the Benin kingdom in Nigeria, those monarchies have a role to play in terms of maintaining those good aspects of African customs and traditions that were developed many, many years ago, but the Europeans tried to destroy. What we do not want is for those rulers, simply because they are not subjected to elections, to put themselves in a position in which they oppress their own people. The traditional rulers are in a position to promote democracy, to promote good governance, to promote the rule of law, to promote progressive development.
The reason is that the way colonial institutions came to us, they came as alien institutions that have not been fully translated. They have not been fully translated into local idioms. So they create a distance in power, they create a distance in connection with citizenship. Those communities, especially on security issues, have to be managed by the locals, by the women who sell their commodities. The woman who sells beans and cigarettes, they know the bad girl, they know the bad boy, they know the bully. And all of them can organize themselves far more effectively than what European-derived state structures can do. And that is why in many zones, without being corrupt, we still need some of those kings and chiefs.